on a number of issues, but in particular the deteriorating relationship between Canada and China. Let's bring in a former counselor to the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. He is Charles Burton, currently a professor of Canada-China relations at Brock University. He joins me from St. Catharines, Ontario, and I want to ask you in a moment about the ambassador's statements today, the Chinese ambassador to Canada's statement today. But first of all, I haven't had a chance to ask you this, or my producers. Did you hear what the Minister Freeland had to say?
Yes, I thought she spoke very well and very prudently on this subject, particularly rejecting any suggestion that there's a connection between Ms. Mung's release and the release of the two Canadians who are currently being unjustly held in China.
She used a word that Chinese officials don't like, the arbitrary detention. She used that word again. The Prime Minister has used it. She used it again. You know, these are words that the Chinese don't like. Is that a problem?
I think that we are doing the right thing in rallying other nations to come to the support of Canada with regard to the use by the Chinese government of this taking of hostages in China, in effect, to pressure governments over political disputes between our nations. So I think the Chinese did not anticipate that so many countries would be prepared to stand up with Canada and demand a rules-based international order and demand that China should comply with international norms with regard to arrest, which would be due process of law. As we know, Mr. Spager and Mr. Kovrig have not been charged with anything, and are being held in an undisclosed black jail, being subject to very severe interrogation. And, you know, this is simply not something that the world should be standing idly by and not protesting.
The Chinese ambassador to Canada says that it would be a bad idea for the Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, to rally support from allies. She's going to Davos, Switzerland soon in this case, and trying to get more countries such as Spain today and others to come to the side of Canada in demanding the release of these Canadians. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a very good idea if our foreign minister does that, and clearly the Chinese government is disturbed that what they regard as a bilateral negotiation between Canada and China to release Ms. Mung turns into something that will seriously affect China's relations with all of the other countries, because of course if a country does speak up against China in this way, China will have to respond to that country as well. So this is really causing them a bigger and bigger problem, and certainly their lack of ability to get Ms. Mung released to Beijing is causing the ambassador to go to more and more extreme statements and measures because of the desperation of the Chinese government to not see Ms. Mung extradited to the United States, where she might in fact provide information about the nature of the Huawei company's relations with the government of China, specifically the security and intelligence apparatus. So, you know, now we're looking at a situation where it's unlikely the Huawei company will in fact be able to install the 5G equipment in our Bell and Telus networks, simply because public opinion has turned so much against China because of the Chinese government's mismanagement of this affair.
And the Chinese ambassador to Canada, LU Shaye, told reporters today that if in fact you are right, Charles, that Canada does bar this new 5G technology from Huawei, that there would be repercussions. What would those repercussions be?
I mean, it's ridiculous. Certainly, he's also suggesting that our government engages in white supremacy, that our government is informed in our judicial system to favor racial norms that are discriminatory of Canadians of Chinese origin and Chinese nationals in Canada, which is completely and utterly false. I mean, the treatment of Ms. Mung, as Minister Freeland pointed out, has been nothing but kind and generous by the Canadian government, particularly compared to the way that the non-Chinese nationals in China of Canadian origin are being treated. And so I really do think that these kinds of specious threats and menacing, and certainly the ascribing of racist motives to the government of Canada is going beyond acceptable diplomatic discourse by the ambassador. And I do wonder if the Canadian government is considering whether this ambassador should no longer be allowed to represent the People's Republic of China in Canada if he's going to say things which are so offensive to Canada and Canadians and slanderous of our government.
Do you think that the Liberal government should consider kicking out the Chinese ambassador to Canada?
Well, I think it's similar to Ms. Freeland's refusing to openly state the obvious, which is the Chinese government, in the cases of Kovrick's Faber and Spellenberg, are attempting to retaliate for Ms. Meng and believe that they can put pressure on the Canadian government to have her released, as if our Prime Minister could pick up the phone and call the judge and have those bail conditions revoked. But I do think in general it's very negative for the future of Canada-China relations, not just Huawei, but prospects of the Chinese goals to get the limitations on Chinese state investment in our energy and minerals sectors reduced, or in fact an extradition treaty, which we were still thinking about up until relatively recently, or the Chinese demands that we reduce the restrictions on the export of high tech to China. None of these things are likely to be on the political agenda right now because Canadian public opinion just would not tolerate, and it could affect the government's prospects for re-election in the next election. In the next election.
Charles, appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Very good to speak with you, Andrew.